came to Carleton to do his master, and where he worked even more on Afro-American and then African things, and for the last few years he's doing a PhD under Price supervision on the topic of this presentation. David also teaches here courses in literary analysis and in literature, so, and we all know him, he often comes to visit us. So welcome, David, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks. So the past couple of brown bag events that I've been to have been somewhat raucous and excitable, and so I wanted to continue in that vein by presenting what could potentially be controversial ideas, which is fun to have a conversation in this context. So I want to talk to you, as Dominique had suggested, a project that I've been working on for at least a couple of years now. I want to speak to you this afternoon about child soldier stories that are written by African authors, but also including how they circulate and are received in the United States, in the American marketplace. Together, if you group all of them together, and these are primarily novels and memoirs, they constitute, I think, one of the most widely consumed genres of African literature today. If people in the United States are reading African literature at all, there's a great chance that what they're reading is child soldier stories. And notwithstanding their respective literary merits, by which I mean some of them are better written than others, the popularity of these stories relies on a pessimistic image of Africa, one that has become epitomized in recent decades by the unsettling phenomenon of the child soldier. Now, these narratives vary in their portrayal of the protagonists. Some of them are positive and largely humanizing, others less so. But collectively, their overemphasis on what I'm going to tell you today is an extant but relatively uncommon practice, the military use of children in Africa, that bolsters the widespread belief that Africa is uncivilized, in scare quotes, and dangerous. Moreover, American readers will often, I argue, compare their own society and culture, and in particular the lives of American children, against these dystopian accounts. Some of the authors of these stories publicly advocate on behalf of these young combatants at national and international levels. Others maintain that these stories can help raise awareness about the issue of the military use of child soldiers. But I've come to conclude, after looking at this for now a few years, that the damage that child soldier stories cause to the already negative reputation of Africa in the United States far exceeds any potential benefits which can be attributed to them. So today what I'm going to do is explain to you how I came to this conclusion and why it matters so much. Now, my research on this subject is grounded in an understanding of the effect of literature on its readers, as well as how Americans comprehend the African continent and its cultural products. Some of Africa's best-known critics and authors, people like Chinua Achebe or Chinwezu, for example, they insist that literature can have a powerful, positive effect on social change in the continent, that literature can be a powerful instrument for social change. But what is the function of African literature outside of Africa? What is the function of African literature in the United States? That's primarily my focus. Many Western representations of Africa are, of course, imaginary. They are projections of the fantasies and fears of their respective authors, as well as the societies in which they are produced. These images contribute to an idea that Christopher Miller calls Africanist discourse, which is the aggregate of impressions that non-African people have about the continent. Now, as African literature becomes much more widely available in the Western world during the past half-decade or so, I argue that it also contributes to this discourse, the ideas that people have about Africa. And because child soldier stories originate in Africa, those texts have often the greatest influence on this discourse, because they are, speaking colloquially, coming from the source. Now, Africanist discourse not only reflects what Africa means to the West, but also which countries are included when we talk about Africa. Northern countries like Algeria or Libya are usually and often erroneously characterized as being Arab. And consequently, even though I don't necessarily agree with that, my research doesn't focus on texts from northern African countries, because they're not perceived as being African by many people in the United States. What I do focus on is literary works written by authors from so-called sub-Saharan Africa. And that includes the first widely available child soldier novel, which was written by Ken Saro-Wiwa in 1984. It's called Soza Boy, in 1985 when it was released in the US. And also the first widely available memoir written by a former child soldier. It's by a woman named China Kitsetsi. It's called Child Soldier. Can't call your books Child Soldier anymore because the title's been used so often. We get stories written for both a general readership, like Ishmael Bea's memoir, also stories that are written for very, very specific audiences. There are some child soldier stories that are written specifically for Christian evangelical audiences, as an example. Stories that are written by well-known authors as well as those by relative unknowns, and literary contributions not only from African-born authors, but also members of the African diaspora. So writers like the American-born writer Uzodimma Iweala, as an example, who was born in Washington, D.C. My analysis of these stories is predicated on the view that their structure and their content and their themes informs their function. And what I mean by that for the non-literary folks is that each of these stories incorporates certain literary devices that guide readers toward particular interpretations, and that guide readers to derive meaning from them in conjunction with what they know about Africa, that Africanist discourse. Now, with respect to the readers themselves, this is a torturous thing all literary scholars have to do, to decide whether we're going to look at reader response or just look at the text or something in between. What I try to do, or at least what I prefer to do, is to emphasize a figure whom a literary scholar named Wolfgang Iser called the imagined reader. And the imagined reader, for the purpose of my research, is a composite from the community of literary readers in the United States. We can at least know a little bit about who reads literary works in the U.S. According to the National Endowment for the Arts, a majority of readers of literary works, when they last did this study in 2004, are ethnically white, university-educated, and possess a combined family income of at least $50,000. Now, to be clear, I don't mean to suggest that people who don't fit that profile do not read child soldier stories or do not read at all. That is not true. But I do maintain that these texts that I'm looking at circulate in a network that encompasses authors and publishers and marketers and booksellers and readers. And that network is, with very few exceptions, specifically oriented towards members of this predominant community of literary readers in the United States. Furthermore, I argue that the network is influenced by the Africanist discourse that informs popular readings of African literature. And finally, that each of the participants in that network contributes to the production and the marketing and the consumption of an Africa that doesn't actually exist. It's an Africa in scare quotes. Now, why doesn't it exist? Well, let me ask you. You don't have to answer this question out loud, but picture in your mind for a moment, what percentage of children in Africa are child soldiers? Is it 10%? Is it 5%? Is it 1%? There is a disproportionality between the military use of children in Africa and the popular literary genre upon which it is based. Underage combatants are by no means a recent phenomenon, nor are they limited to the African continent. However, even though child soldiers do not operate in an overwhelming majority of African states, they have become symbolic of the instability that troubles some of Africa. Now, in 2004, the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers estimated that as many as 100,000 children had been recruited across the continent. So the Coalition for the Use of Child Soldiers said the maximum estimate that they have is 100,000 children who are being used as soldiers in Africa. It also indicated in its more recent study in 2008 that, quote, tens of thousands have been disarmed and demobilized, and that their overall use has declined in recent years. But I'll work with a maximum number that they'll give me, 100,000 child soldiers. UNICEF estimates the number of African children between the ages of 6 and 17, and that is the typical age of recruitment for child soldiers, is 277 million on the African continent. Now, I am not a mathematician, so I used a calculator. What this means is that although the military use of children is without question a deplorable practice, and there's not a single person in this room who will say that children should be used in this capacity, we all agree that it is a problem. But these figures demonstrate that it is an extremely marginal practice. Only 0.036% of African children, or in other words, less than 0.04%, are child soldiers. If you use the same kind of figures, you could actually argue that there are more child soldiers officially in the United States military than there are on the African continent, because 17-year-olds are allowed to be part of the United States military. Now, notwithstanding this statistical data, and the data is clear, Western publishers and distributors have leveraged this notoriously iconic image of the young child combatant to such a degree that we can refer to the child soldier story as a distinct genre of literary writing. What I mean by that is there are a lot of child soldier stories that are out there. How popular are they exactly? Well, unfortunately, the US publishing industry can be extremely secretive about its sales volumes. We actually tried to purchase that information through the Carleton Library, and they refused to sell it to us. A business that sells this information would not give it to us, even after we agreed to pay them. But that said, I have recovered some information, and I can give you some comparisons. For example, during the first year of its publication in 2006, Ishmael Bea, his memoir, A Long Way Gone, which is maybe the most famous child soldier memoir out there, it was ranked the 15th, it was the 15th ranked title, I should say, on the US bestseller list. It sold 334,000 hardcover copies. Now, by way of comparison, I can tell you that it sold more copies than US President Barack Obama's memoir, The Audacity of Hope, which was released in that same year, and that was an election year, so people were actually paying attention. So, we can at least make some comparisons that Ishmael Bea's child soldier memoir sold more than the President of the United States. Now, another indication of the popular appeal of child soldier stories is their attractiveness to major Western publishers. For a long time, historically, African literary works were made available by just two publishers in the United States, either Heinemann or Longman. You got your African lit through Heinemann or Longman. And they were catering to a niche market in the United States. This was the case with Ken Saro-Wiwa's Soda Boy, for example. That was the publisher you could get it through, Longman. Now that child soldier stories have become profitable, or they're known to be profitable, mainstream publishing conglomerates like HarperCollins or St. Martin's Press, which are two of the largest publishers in the entire world, they deliberately seek out the rights to produce these stories. So, paradoxically, there is an inverse relationship between the increasing portrayal of African child soldiers for American audiences and the ever-decreasing frequency of their actual use on the African continent. Now, in much of my work, I explore some of the consequences of these portrayals of Africa through close readings of the narratives. That's more or less what we do in literary studies. Now, novels and memoirs are not objective accounts of lived experience. They're not objective accounts. They are artistic representations. But even so, as a number of African literary critics like Simon Gikandi and Otto Quayson and others have suggested, many Western readers comprehend African literature ethnographically. And what I mean by that is many Western readers read African literature as if it was apparently realistic documentations of everyday life, whether or not that is actually the case. With respect to child soldier stories, there are two significant dimensions to this interpretive framework. The structure of many of these narratives facilitates the classical imperialist notion that African states, and by extension their leaders and their citizens, are childlike, that they are incapable of peaceful and cohesive self-governance, much less the halting of the actual practice of the use of child soldiers. So President Theodore Roosevelt made this comparison between Africa and adolescence at the turn of the century, and that metaphor still lingers today. Most notably, it's been expressed by a few Western commentators in their appraisals of Africa's history on the occasion of Africa's figurative 50th birthday, which happened in 2010. There were a lot of African retrospectives, and the comparisons between the African continent today and its states and its citizens to children was uncomfortably common, I think, for those of us who know better. Although most certainly not intended, child soldier stories often contribute to this impression. For instance, the structural logic of a novel like Allah is Not Obliged by Amadou Kourouma. It's a fairly famous one, in which the young protagonist is required by the circular nature of the plot to narrate his story indefinitely. The end of the story is exactly the same as the beginning of the story, and if you read the novel the way it's supposed to be written, you have to begin it again, and then end and begin it again indefinitely. As a storyteller, he's kind of trapped in a kind of feedback loop. He's forced to remain a child soldier in perpetuity. That kind of literary technique reflects this idea that the social and political and economic circumstances in Africa will never improve, that they will in perpetuity be that way, that Africa suffers from a kind of arrested development, to use the discourse of childhood. At the same time, the powerlessness of most regular everyday African people to effect positive change in their respective countries is signaled in a lot of these stories by the literal inability to speak, a condition that afflicts many children, child characters I should say, in these child soldier stories, like Awela's novel and Chris Abani's Song for Night and others. Now, in addition, American readers also, I argue, derive meaning from these accounts by using them as a means for cross-cultural comparison. Because if someone believes that children are fundamentally the same the world over, and I maintain that in the United States and many other Western countries that notion is commonplace, that children are the same no matter where they are born, then it follows that you can learn much about a particular society from how their children integrate into adulthood and their experiences during this process. Ever since the broadcast of footage of malnourished children suffering from famine in Biafra during the late 1960s, such images have been thought to epitomize the African experience. Africa was distilled to the image of the starving child, in other words. They became part of the American lexicon as an idiomatic reproach. Some of you may have heard from your parents, warning you at mealtime to eat everything on your plate. There are children starving in Africa. That was a clear indication that the lives of American children were much better than their African counterparts. But as public assessments of childhood in the United States have become increasingly fraught during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, American childhood is said to be at risk of decline or disappearance. A new paradigm has emerged on the African side, that of the child soldier. American parents now remind themselves that although childhood appears increasingly under threat in the United States, these conditions have not deteriorated to the degree that is represented in African child soldier stories. So Africa still represents the worst possible future that Americans can imagine for their children. It is still the sort of substandard against which circumstances in the United States are continually and always negatively measured. Stories like Emmanuel Dongola's Johnny Mad Dog, or China Katsetzi's Child Soldier, or Ken Saro-Wiwa's Soza Boy, they all depict the lives of children in Africa as being radically different from the lives of children in the United States. And so, in a very sort of real material way, what that means is that chronological age and the terms that are commonly used to identify various stages of the life cycle, they no longer have any meaning in these texts. Anyone can be called a child. Anyone can be called an adult. Age grades, which determine a person's rights and their responsibilities and their obligations and their culpability or their accountability for their crimes, that is replaced by military rank, which can be held by persons of any age. Physical spaces, which are specifically designed for children, like the schoolroom, are incorporated into the battlefield, the latter of which is still considered, at least in theory, in the United States to be an exclusively adult domain, though don't ask us about Omar Khadr and a few other folks. Many adolescent characters in these stories prematurely achieve adult agency and are subjected to adult experiences. For these reasons, the children portrayed in these texts, they often manifest abnormal social or emotional development because adulthood no longer represents for them the ideal end of this teleological system. Other imagined characteristics of childhood the theological idea, for example, that children are simultaneously constituted of innocence and evil, that children are simultaneously innocent and evil. That's also greatly amplified by their participation in war in these fictional narratives. The best example is maybe in Johnny Mad Dog. If any of you have ever read that before, there's a character named Laukole, who is meant to represent innocent perseverance. She's the child who's doing everything right, in comparison to the child who becomes a soldier who's doing everything wrong. Yet in the final pages of this story, this young girl, Laukole, brutally disfigures and kills that eponymous child soldier, Johnny. She must murder one child, in other words, in order to nurture another child whom she has adopted, whom she has taken under her wing. So it's not even that easy to be an innocent child in the story. Now, some authors of child soldier stories have expressed their views about the possible reasons for why the genre has become so popular. Iwela describes the fascination of Western audiences with the tragedies that sometimes occur in Africa as, and this is a quote from him, the same attitude that people have when they pass a gruesome road accident. Nevertheless, he insists that his novel, and that others like it, have the effect of humanizing their adolescent subjects. Perhaps the most common justification for these stories is that the success of some, not all of them are successful, but some of them are, and that their success, particularly autobiographical accounts, provides the authors with the public platform to raise awareness, a phrase I have come to hate, to raise awareness about child soldiers in Africa. And so that these authors can publicly advocate on their behalf, either at the national or international levels. The most obvious examples of this practice are Emmanuel Jal, who is now a spokesperson for the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers, and Ishmael Bey, who is an ambassador for UNICEF and a board member at Human Rights Watch. And yet the problem here is not one of awareness. It's not an awareness problem. And it's not a problem relating to the establishment of international laws either. In 1999, the African Union enacted a continent-wide ban on soldiers under the age of 18. That was 1 year before the United Nations authored its optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, and that protocol only outlaws underage conscription. Still, the uncommon practice of recruiting child soldiers continues, albeit at a decreasing rate, as neither of those agreements have been properly enforced. Here's the thing. Many child soldier stories convey the idea that African childhoods cannot be recovered, but through foreign intervention. That the only way these children can become children again is through foreign intervention. That idea is demonstrated structurally, for the example, in the arrangement of some stories, like the quasi-memoir, Girl Soldier. It's by two authors, Grace Akolo, who describes her experiences as a child soldier in Uganda, and an evangelical woman named Faith Donald, whose excessively patronizing account of the history of Uganda and the supposed savagery of its non-Christian citizens overwhelms the story that the child soldier is trying to tell about what she had experienced. In contrast, characters like Mene and Sozaboy, the protagonist, he doesn't have anyone to rescue him. He's not rescued by Westerners, and he is portrayed as unable to integrate back into his society. And his society is depicted as unable to assist him in this process. He doesn't have a Western savior, therefore he cannot become a child again. Similarly, one of the most common character types in these narratives is the Western humanitarian aid worker. They're just sort of thrown in, even if they don't necessarily have a function for the plot of the story. And that Western humanitarian aid worker frequently brings young combatants back with them to West, where they can become children again. For these reasons, and in conjunction with my analysis of how these stories often function for American readers, I can only conclude that the negative consequences of their circulation in the U.S. greatly exceed any potential benefits. The pessimistic image of Africa in the United States has been molded and it's been fixed by an assortment of misconceptions that comprise Africanist discourse. Achebe famously argued in reference to Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness, that even when authors intend to distance themselves from their own depictions of Africa, their subversive projects are necessarily lost if no obvious alternative is presented. And too often this charge applies to child soldier stories as well. These stories frequently strengthen rather than contest Africanist discourse. Their material successes are to be admired. These are people who've made it, so to speak, in the book industry, at least some of them. But their material successes come at what I argue is an unacceptable cost. And that is a further dynamiting of the image of Africa in the West. So what are we to conclude from this information? Well, this is where we can get contentious. Can anything be done about this negative and inaccurate representation of Africa? Should anything be done about this negative and inaccurate representation of Africa? 90 years ago, W.B. Du Bois posed a number of questions in his magazine called The Crisis, which addressed these same kinds of concerns, but from an African-American perspective and in an African-American context. He asked, quote, "Can any author be criticized for painting the worst or best characters of a group?" He asked, "When the artist portrays black characters, is he under any obligations or limitations as to the sort of character he will portray?" He also asked whether you should hold publishers accountable for publishing depictions or portrayals of black characters that are not accurate. Now Chinwezu, who's a very famous and sort of iconoclastic literary critic from Nigeria, he had an answer to this sort of issue, at least from the perspective of the African artist. In 1983, he said, "The function of the artist in Africa, in keeping with our traditions and needs, demands that the writer, as a public voice, assume a responsibility to reflect public concerns in his writing. Because in Africa we recognize that art is in a public domain. A sense of social commitment is therefore mandatory upon the artist." Now, I do not mean to suggest that African writers should seek the approval of critics, black ones or white ones. I do not mean to suggest that they should counter Western stereotypes with their own propaganda and suggest that everything's cheery and funny, because it's not. And I do not mean to suggest that they should be regulated or legislated or externally censored in any way. What I am talking about, though, is the very real distinction between the conveyance of facts, and child soldiers do exist in fact, and the conveyance of truths. Is the existence of some child soldiers in Africa a truth of Africa? And is an accurate representation of the lived experience of most African people? I would argue that it isn't, and that we're going to have to start asking some of those questions critically and seriously and maybe even a little aggressively in order to plumb out how we can positively change the very negative portrayal of Africa in the United States as it exists today. Thanks.